Welcome back into the Lions 24/7 podcast. I am Tyler Donahue. He is Daniel Gallen. It's about 3 a.m. Here in Fort Lauderdale, Florida on Friday, and Penn State football season is over. It ended Thursday night in Hard Rock Stadium here at the Orange Bowl. Penn State 27-24 loss to Notre Dame, and it was a stinging defeat. We'll get into some of the more frustrating circumstances that led to this result. It's a game that Penn State led 10-0 in the second quarter. It's a game that Penn State led 24-17 with just a few minutes remaining. It's a matchup in which they went over 200 rushing yards. They won the turnover battle, but they are not going to the national championship. Daniel, this is our 16th post-game podcast. Penn State finishes 13-3. That's an NFL record, but that's where we are with college football. They are left on the doorstep, and Notre Dame will figure out if they face Texas or Ohio State in the next round. That awaits in Atlanta. Penn State, at certain moments of this night, sure felt like they were about to break through and get there, but ultimately their run and our coverage for this 2024 going on 2025 season has concluded.
Definitely. You look at how the flow of the game went with how Penn State seemed to find its footing early to take that 10-0 lead. They take the 10-3 lead into halftime. And at that point, at the break, I think we felt really good about where Penn State stood. Notre Dame had some success late to get that field goal right before halftime, and we knew they were going to get the ball coming out. But given how Penn State had played through that early part, there was really, I think, no real reason to feel like things were going to go the way that they went the rest of the second half. I mean, it's almost time to look up what the weather forecast was going to be in Atlanta. But Notre Dame, this is the point in the season where the final four teams are the final four teams for a reason. I didn't expect Notre Dame to, go out all the way easily. They lost 2 offensive linemen in the early going, and yet they put themselves in position to make it a game. And when you get into these tie games late, anything can happen and any play can swing the game. Notre Dame had, a couple more of those plays today.
Let's begin with the elephant in the room, Daniel. It was largely a rough night for Drew Aller and Penn State's pass attack. No receiver caught a pass over the course of 60 minutes against Notre Dame. Drew Aller's across-the-body interception, a really puzzling decision, and a puzzling throw there in the final minute of a tie game in your own territory gave Notre Dame an opportunity to just pick up a few yards there, put themselves in a manageable field goal situation, which ultimately was converted. 2 interceptions were overturned over the course of the night, but the third one did stand, and it's the one that was his first interception of these playoffs. It goes beyond that turnover, but this is the play that people are going to be thinking about here in the days to come, weeks to come, and unfortunately for Drew Aller, months to come. And Daniel, you were in that press room. I was over in the locker room catching up with some players. You were in the podium room where James Franklin was, and Drew Aller and Nick Singleton. And Aller was asked directly about that decision and that play in postgame. Can you tell us what you learned from Drew about what ultimately was the decisive moment for Penn State in terms of keeping them out of an overtime possibility, or maybe just getting to Atlanta outright? Instead, it ends in regulation.
Yeah, Drew Aller said that he was working across his progression. His first 2 reads were taken, and so he was trying to dirt it, aka throw the ball at Omari Evans's feet. We've seen him do this before. Oftentimes, it's with a running back behind the line of scrimmage, that sort of deal. But he just didn't get it enough into the ground and put it a little bit too far out in front of Evans. And so Christian Gray was able to make a really, really impressive diving catch there. And so, he said that next time he has to throw that ball away. Don't try to be too clever with it, throwing it at the feet, just get rid of it. Excuse me. And that was just, I think it was puzzling is the best way to put it. In real time, the explanation I think helps a little bit, but there's still some very obvious ways that could have gone differently. You mentioned that Aller had the 2 interceptions overturned earlier. The first one, there was a holding penalty. I think it was Christian Gray on Harrison Wallace, and I think one of the explanations that I saw, online for that was that you throw that ball, even if you know it'll get intercepted, because it puts the officials in more of a position where they have to make the call. Because it makes it more obvious that the player was affected. And I think the flag was already out. Everyone could do where that one was going. The other one, Adon Schuler, got called for DPI on an underthrown ball to Tyler Warren in the end zone. That was a play where Warren was open. Like if Aller puts that ball out ahead of Warren, it's smooth sailing. He catches that, but it turned into a contested catch. Jack Kaiser came underneath, made a nice play on the ball. I think it could have gone either way. Like I think if they hadn't called pass interference, I probably would have been fine. I was fine with them calling it. Just one of those plays. So, we hadn't seen Aller put the ball in harm's way too much over the course of his career. And over the course of the season, but there were a couple times where that stood out a little bit Thursday night, and then the very last time is when he gets burned.
Yeah, Penn State had an opportunity, to potentially take the lead and win this game at the end of regulation, and they decided to go for it. And you certainly understand with I think they had 40 some seconds left on the clock. The first play of that possession is a run for Nick Singleton, 13-yard pickup. And so you're in some business. You go from being at the 15-yard line to your own 28. Now you've got a ways to go to get in field goal range, but it's 1st and 10. And you want to live to play another down. You want to get some chunk yards. You want to fight and try to survive. But ultimately, that the coaching staff made it clear to Drew Aller, you also want to avoid a big mistake that's going to breathe life into Notre Dame. That's going to give them an opportunity because Notre Dame had their shot. They sent their offense on the field. Penn State came up with a defensive stop, forced a punt. They did their job there at the end, and ultimately they were able to get that interception. And by the way, it was a play that was intended for Omari Evans, like you said, but Dre makes an outstanding play on that. It's a heck of a catch on his part. But they get the ball, and it's not that complicated. They start at Penn State's 42-yard line. Some keepers from Riley Leonard. They're able to kind of situate things. And then the big play, though, kind of the backbreaker, 3rd and 3 from the Penn State 35-yard line, a 10-yard pass to Jaden Greathouse. And Greathouse ends up going over 100 yards on the day. That was a clutch play. He had a few of them. This is the first time Notre Dame's had a receiver go over 100 yards in a game this year, and it is their 15th contest of the season. And then you look to the other side of this, and the supplemental discussion here with Drew Aller is his receiver group, and that has been the supplemental discussion with him for both of his years as a starting quarterback at the college level. And today, I mentioned it earlier, but they played 60 minutes of football. Not a single receiver had a single reception. 5 targets, no completions, and that costly interception in the direction of Omari Evans in the final minute of this matchup. When Drew Aller was looking for tight ends, 9 of 10, 103 yards. Daniel, this is something that you, me, Mark will get into, I think, early next week. We'll do a little bit more of a big picture conversation coming out of this matchup, and wide receivers going to be on that list. But keeping it within the context of the Orange Bowl, here we go again. I mean, it's just this is the exact opposite punctuation mark that you had hoped to put at the end of this season. If you were Drew Aller, if you were James Franklin, if you were Andy Kotelnicki, and probably most importantly, Marcus Hagan's the receiver coach, this is not the taste you wanted left in the mouth, because it feels a lot like the kind of conversations we had coming out of Atlanta last year, except in this occasion, maybe a catch, maybe 2 catches gets you to the national championship game. And acknowledging that Drew Aller was by no means, by no means was he up to the task today. It wasn't his best performance. It wasn't even an average performance from Drew Aller. But we have to acknowledge that receivers did nothing statistically in this matchup. And you got good soldiers in that room. They're blocking. They're putting effort. But the first thing you do when you show up to practice as a receiver when you're 6 years old is you figure out if you can catch the football. That's a really important factor. You've got a 5-star talent at quarterback. And to this point, he started about, 30 games almost, Daniel? And he's done it with wide receiver groups that have not risen to the occasion. And it leads you to wonder, in these big matchups against stellar defenses and sticky coverage downfield, is it Drew Aller? Is it this receiver room? Is it a combination of both? At the end of the day, it's not good enough.
Definitely. I wrote a story earlier Thursday or Wednesday, I forget which day at this point, but it had been one of the conversations. We talked to Omari Evans last weekend in State College before we came down. We talked to Liam Clifford when we got here. James Franklin went out and said that he doesn't think the wide receivers were getting enough credit for what they were doing. And I think that we all know and we've all heard that the contributions go way beyond just the catches, yards, touchdowns, all that stuff. And I think we've seen, the different contributions that show up throughout the course of the season. But it is your job to catch the ball, to get open, to be in position, and the wide receivers just, for whatever reason, could not do that on Thursday night. You talk about the Peach Bowl from a year ago. That's something that has come up with those wide receivers. I think it came up talking to guys in media day in August. Omari Evans talked about it, in terms of, they didn't want to feel that way again. Liam Clifford talked a little bit about it in terms of, they knew the criticism that they were getting coming out of the Peach Bowl last year. I mean, I think that one of the differences in this one is that, like, it's a little different because last year you had the contrast with Jackson Dart just throwing it all over them. You don't have that this time, which helps, I think, a little bit. But at the same time, you have a guy like Jaden Greathouse, who I don't think was over 100 yards all season. And
No one was over 100 yards receiving all season for Notre Dame. Not a single player, tight end, wide receiver, running back, otherwise, no one, I don't even think got to 90 receiving yards in a game.
Yeah, and Riley Leonard threw for 90 yards, period, against Georgia in the Sugar Bowl. So you're talking about an offense that doesn't necessarily light it up. And so for Penn State to go out and just lay that goose egg, I think that's really tough. CBS Sports Research got us the nugget that Penn State is the first non-service academy, so a team that isn't Army, Navy, or Air Force, which are primarily option teams, to finish a game without a catch by a wide receiver this year. And there's only 2 games left in the college football season. Like, there's been a lot of college football played over the past 4.5 months, however long it's been at this point. And so I think that's a pretty glaring stat, and something that an area you don't want to be talked about in, that you don't want to happen. So I'm sure that we'll talk about ways that these guys can get better, how they can turn the room over, who could potentially come in and help. But it's going to be another long off season when it comes to pass catchers in Penn State, over these next few months.
You've got Devontae Ross coming in from Troy. You've got Kyron Hudson coming in from USC. You've already got freshman wide receivers who joined as early enrollees. But got questions, man. Service Academy in the regular season is one thing. Penn State Nittany Lions in the national semifinal is an entirely different stage for this to happen on. And let's focus on some positives, though, offensively. I think you got really pretty much what you were hoping to get from Nick Singleton, from Katron Allen, from Tyler Warren, and from this offensive line. I thought overall, against a pretty stout Notre Dame defense that has really made its living on exploiting offensive mistakes, which obviously they eventually got. But they have been so turnover happy. They've been great at frustrating opposing backfields, limiting the rush attacks. And early on, I think Nick Singleton and Katron Allen had combined for like 120 rushing yards, midway through the second quarter at that point. And when they turned to those guys, they really were impactful. Nick Singleton had a trio of touchdowns. He's now top 3 all time in total touchdowns at Penn State. And Tyler Warren goes over 1,200 yards. I believe he's only the 5th tight end in modern college football to go over 1,200 receiving yards. He's also over 100 catches on the year. Some guys were catching passes. It wasn't the receiver position, but the tight end position, notably Tyler Warren. So we got to put that there. It wasn't like a complete dud dropped by Penn State. There's going to be things we're poking holes in. There's going to be storylines that loom large in the offseason coming out of this game. But let's not act like Penn State didn't show up to the stadium ready to play. And some of these players in particular, including, I feel for the most part, that collective unit on the offensive line who strung together a really fantastic postseason, I thought, largely. I mean, look, you had the pieces out there and you had them getting the job done. You tell me Nick Singleton's going to score 3 touchdowns, Katron Allen's going to get his, and you're going to win the turnover battle. I mean, it sounds like a great recipe, and ultimately it wasn't enough.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Penn State had the right recipe. And the two areas that James Franklin pointed out were third down. Penn State was 3 of 11, Notre Dame was 11 of 17. And then the middle eight, which I think was like the middle eight plus a little bit.
And a half. Yeah.
Because it took Notre Dame a little bit more than 4 minutes for that first touchdown drive in the second half. But you talk about what the Penn State offense was doing when things were rolling. I made a tongue-in-cheek reference that early on it seemed like no one else but Kaytron Allen needs to touch the ball, and it seems like that they would be able to take care of business. It really felt like they were gashing Notre Dame in the early going. I thought the Penn State offensive line was really dictating the terms of how things were going. Penn State was putting together some really long, sustained drives. You look at the touchdown drive, 15 plays, 90 yards, 7 minutes, 17 seconds. That felt demoralizing for Notre Dame when that drive ended, and that put you up 10-0. And that's when it was like, okay, we're going to Atlanta next week. Just having that sort of drive in that spot to have that sort of margin when your defense is playing in that way, like that felt like, okay, you might have broken them.
And by the way, a moment later, Riley Leonard's in the medical tent getting checked out for a concussion. And let's point it out, Steve Angeli, their backup quarterback who played prep ball in New Jersey, he goes in, he completes 6 passes, and they get 3 points off that possession. And all of a sudden, okay, it's 10-3. Notre Dame probably feels like they have their footing a little bit. By the time they get into the locker room, Riley Leonard's been cleared. And so then Notre Dame gets the ball to start the second half, and they go down, score a touchdown. It's like, we've seen this show before from the Fighting Irish, and all of a sudden it's a brand new ball game at 10-10.
Yeah, things happen quick, and suddenly it was a 0-0 game again in the second half, and that cushion that Penn State had was gone. So, I think I felt like as a whole, I felt like Penn State played well enough to win this game, and I think if you look at the box score, even with the turnovers, even with the third down issues, and you look at the raw stats, it looks like Penn State did enough to win. But Notre Dame just made some really good plays in really good spots. I think Marcus Freeman deserves a lot of credit for having his team believe and putting them in the right position to succeed. And this is one that I think if you're Penn State, it just really, really stings.
Notre Dame after halftime was better at running the football. We saw a different version of Love, their running back, who was banged up coming into the game. He had 10 yards on 3 carries in the first half. I think he had the first 3 carries of their first drive of the second half and turned that into 24 yards. And so Jeremiah Love was getting going a little bit. They did a better job against Penn State's rush attack. But at the end of the day, I think probably the most surprising thing here, and it's just I didn't think it would get to this place, is that Riley Leonard outplayed Drew Aller, and he made more significant passes over the course of this game, distributing the football. He made some really key runs, which we knew was part of his plan. But Drew Aller, he had that one, I think, 11-yard pickup on a 3rd and 6 during touchdown drive, but he wasn't the same dynamic weapon. And overall, just the footwork was pretty rough today, it seemed, for Drew Aller at first glance. And I think that carried over to his ability as a mobile presence and trying to do things with his feet. And so ultimately, it felt like Drew Aller spent much of this game kind of trying to figure things out to no avail. And they had some really long touchdown drives. And I think you mentioned one was like 15 plays, but it was like 86 of the 89 yards were on the ground. And it's okay. It's worked so far, right? In the playoffs. I mean, Drew Aller threw for, I'm going back and look, he threw for 127 yards against SMU. He threw for 171 yards against Boise State, but you were never worried about those matchups. The ground game led the way. The defense did its job. And it just felt like in a matchup where there were a few moments where both quarterbacks had their chances. And Riley Leonard made some mistakes. He coughed up the ball a couple times, but they had their chances. And you ended up at the end of the game putting more of those notches in the column for Riley Leonard than from Drew Aller. And admittedly, if you listen to our pregame podcast, I was pretty confident that wouldn't be the case. And that really was a separating factor on a day when neither defense was perfect. I don't think neither defense quite lived up to its dominant billing over the course of 4 quarters. And additionally, on a day where it was very little margin, just it was possession by possession. It felt like you could either make a costly mistake or do yourself a big favor to push yourself closer to the national title game. And Riley Leonard was able to take advantage of those moments, deliver in those moments. And Drew Aller's going to be facing a long offseason here. He's banked a lot of money. He's got a lot of great stats in his college level, but he's going to be wearing this one pretty tough. And it just leads you to wonder, what happens next there. But that was the storyline, Drew. Daniel, it was that Drew got outplayed by Riley Leonard in kind of these magnified moments. And quarterbacks win football games, or quarterbacks can lose football games, and that's the business of the sport. That's why everybody wants to be that guy. But when it doesn't work out and you get a defeat like this, a loss like this, it's a difficult thing to stomach. And I think the fan base is having a difficult time right now across Nittany Lions Nation and trying to internalize how they're supposed to feel about Drew Aller now through 2 seasons, given the latest installment of his progression.
Yeah, I have a story up on Lions247.com right now about what Drew Aller had to say about not only that interception at the end of the game, but his overall performance and some feedback from James Franklin about how he played. Franklin said that, Drew Aller's hurting. He was really wearing this loss. I think we talked about it earlier this year, like his demeanor after the Ohio State and Oregon losses was a little bit different than what we'd seen after the Ohio State and Michigan losses in 2023. But this is different. This is the playoffs. This is the semifinals. There's an era finality that comes with it. And we saw that, very emotional Aller that we haven't seen too often this year. And Franklin said that, yeah, he's hurt. Like, of course he's hurting after, what transpired on that field. But he expects Aller to learn from it and to get better as they go forward. So I think it's a tough one for Drew Aller, but it sounds like his teammates have his back. His coach has his back, and this is something that he's set to come back next year. So this is something that I assume will provide some motivation this offseason, and something for him to build on as they move forward.
Yeah, his teammates were quick to circle the wagons in that locker room. I know I spoke with Denai Dennis Sutton. He was very emotional generally, and that's kind of who he is, but he was particularly passionate in defending his quarterback. He talked about defensive lapses. He said, if we don't give up 24 points, if we don't give up that game-tying touchdown, 50-plus yard reception with 5 minutes left, then we are not putting Drew Aller in a position where he can make a mistake like that. And that's a great thing. You want to hear that from a teammate. But at the end of the day, Drew Aller knows what life at quarterback is like. And you look at the Ohio State game this year, we know that's a defining game for both him and James Franklin. No touchdowns, 1 interception, 140 yards passing. I think he completed 3 passes to wide receivers in that one, and he had one of his wide receivers get the ball snatched out of his hands in the end zone. And so we're thinking when it's a heavyweight fight, and you've got the Muhammad Ali on your schedule across the field from you, it hasn't been pretty for both James Franklin and for Drew Aller. And Franklin's got 11 years of track record with Penn State. Drew Aller's got 2, former top quarterback in the country. I want to ask you, Daniel, and this is short term. We're prisoners of the moment. We're going to get beyond this loss, and I think we're going to appreciate the 13 wins that Penn State had and also the way the program is developing in this new era. But right now, it's 3 a.m. after an Orange Bowl loss. So I want to ask
almost 4 a.m.
Almost 4. Is James Franklin or Drew Aller nationally wearing this loss more?
That's a good question. I think that I'm going to split the difference on it. I think that with James Franklin, he has that track record, and his record against AP top 5 or whatever it is, that stat gets a lot of run. So I think a lot of people are familiar with that. It's 1-15 now at Penn State, 1-18 overall for James Franklin in his career. And so I think that that's something that, people will seize on, maybe people who maybe follow college football a little bit more closely and are familiar with the idea of big game James and those sorts of things. I think for people who watch the game closely and, might be a little bit more casual, I think Drew Aller probably wears it maybe a little bit more there because he threw that interception in the big spot. Because even though he threw those 2 interceptions that got overturned, they're not on the stat sheet. But if you watch the game, that still colors how you view what he did. In the story I read it too, there's just times where he just felt like a tick off. He had Nick Singleton on the wheel up the right side when they're deep in their own territory. They couldn't connect. He had another play earlier in the first quarter where Tyler Warren was open up the right sideline. He couldn't hit him there. He had the miscommunication with Omari Evans on that, play where, Evans just never turned around and took a pretty big hit. So there were just these things that just felt a little off. And so I think if you're watching the game, and maybe you tune out some of the overall stuff, and you're watching that game in the vacuum, you probably come away with pinning a couple more things onto Drew Aller, and then from a bigger picture national perspective, the narratives, all of that stuff. I think that some people are pretty quick to put another one on James Franklin in a big spot.
Yeah, big picture will be a topic of conversation for us next week, but just focusing on some of the details from tonight. Abdul Carter got back to business. I thought he was as advertised in terms of what you'd expect from Abdul Carter, but I thought he played more than I really anticipated, considering where he was coming in the week. I think we all thought he was going to be involved, probably start the game, but would it be on kind of a pitch count? Would it be more of a specialized role? He was out there, and he rarely went to the sideline, and Abdul Carter made an impact. He had a pass breakup. He had a QB hurry. He had multiple pressures. He had open field tackles. He had hard hits. He had a sack. And there's a guy fighting through some things. And so I thought him and Denai Dennis Sutton, opposite of him, who has really played well throughout this postseason, stood up. And I bring those guys up because we know what Abdul Carter is going to do. The Big Ten Defensive Player of the Year might be the number one defensive player off the 2025 NFL draft board. Whenever he wants to announce, that's great. But I think we all know when he's going and where he's going. Denai Dennis Sutton fits into that category, Daniel, of guys that we're going to need to monitor in the coming hours. Quite frankly, we don't. We're going to go to sleep here for a few hours, and we're going to wake up and try to see if we missed anything. Because once the season ends, and that's the way college football works, you're keeping an eye on NFL draft declarations. You're keeping an eye on transfer portal decisions. And so I asked directly to Denai and to linebacker Kobe King. Both of them have one more year of eligibility left. Both of them have multiple seasons of significant Big Ten football under their belt. Neither of them were ready in this setting to say what they want to do in 2025. James Franklin said it at the podium. He expects a lot of talented players to be back and to be hungry and to take this experience and carry it forward. But Daniel, the next few days, the next week or so could really go a long way towards whether Penn State's going to be near the top of the pecking order in presumed contenders out of the Big Ten, or if people are going to see them maybe taking a step backwards, because they've got a lot of guys from that class of 2022 in particular who've come, balled out. There's reason that you think they might want to return, get a fourth year, maybe build their draft stock, but it's a personal decision, and I think we got to wait and see. But I'm just going to kind of leave it there with the podcast here, Daniel, is this team's going to change in a hurry. And I know that was really kind of the angst for a lot of players in there, and some of the really sad faces and tears that we saw in that locker room is just the fact that it's over. The party's over. You got to get on that plane, go back to Pennsylvania, and get scattered again. Guys are going to go pro. Guys are going to be done with their college football career. Guys are going to go in the transfer portal. Many guys will be back, and they'll be in the winter conditioning. They'll be in spring ball. But college football is a different beast because you're guaranteed to have that significant changeover every year. And Daniel, it's tough. It's tough to see them have to react like this. Probably about as emotional as of a locker room as I can recall. And I think what really set that emotion off is they saw over the course of this game, they saw over the course of December, they were capable of going toe-to-toe and competing for a national championship. And I know how much they wanted another shot at Ohio State. So for it to end this close to that goal and in this kind of fashion, heartbreaking stuff if you're just talking about the mental and emotional makeup of the young men who fill this roster.
Yeah, Nick Singleton kind of touched on that point after the game where he was asked a question that was framed like, how much does coming this far give you motivation for next year? And he said, well, I don't know what I'm doing for next year yet. I'm focused on this right now. This is our last time together. This is the last time with this team. And he basically said the same things that you just did. And so, yeah, I mean, this team is going to look very different next year. I asked James Franklin, a question, and I framed it as, we know how much these things can change. They change quickly. It's such a year-to-year sport now than it was in the past. So it was, what do you think this did for Penn State this year? And, and he said that it was a big accomplishment. He's really proud of what everyone was able to accomplish. But you do get the impression that this is going to eat at them a little bit. James Franklin is probably as emotional as we've ever seen him on the podium. He was wiping away some tears. He had a couple opportunities where he deflected with a little bit of humor and those things where he was getting really choked up, and then the moderator said last question and Franklin just starts laughing. He's like, oh, thank you so much. And so you really saw that I think this team believed that they had a good opportunity to win a national championship. You talk about that draw, SMU, Boise State, a banged up Notre Dame team. It was there for them. And basically, if you got to Atlanta, that's when you just really roll the dice and go and see where it all lands. So, I think that this is one they're going to rue. This is one that was there for them to take. It's going to be tough to get over, but they got to be over it pretty soon because they got to get ready for what this team is going to look like this spring, what this team will look like by the end of the summer, and whenever what I think is it's Nevada on August 30th that comes to Beaver Stadium. That you got to be ready for that.
Yeah, you got the Murderers Row to open up next season. Nevada, Florida International, and Villanova coming to Beaver Stadium before a bye week. But then Oregon comes to town. So that lies ahead. We've got a full offseason. All of a sudden, it's ahead of us. But like I said, it's going to be a very busy, borderline chaotic, hectic few days here coming for us because of the roster turnover. We're going to be keeping tabs on the coaching staff as well. These guys have been locked in. Now it's time to come up for air and think about yourself a little bit rather than simply the team. And we'll see what that results in for this roster as we move forward. Daniel, it's been a pleasure. We've done this 16 different times over the course of the season from a variety of different states. It was good to sit alongside with you today there in Hard Rock Stadium, and not the outcome that Penn State fans wanted. And again, we'll pick up the pieces a little bit more next week, but Final Four for Penn State, not quite getting through to the national championship game. And this is one of those that they'll be talking about for a long time, but we'll see if Drew Aller can rewrite that narrative a little bit next season, and we'll be with it. Follow us at Lions247.com. A lot more coming your way out of this matchup coverage over there. Anything else to add before we say goodnight?
Yeah, I would just say thank you to everyone who listened this year. We appreciate all the feedback. We know that we have a very dedicated and loyal fan base, and I really appreciate that because it means that every time we turn on the microphone, every time we got to turn on the camera, we got to be on our A game, even at 3:57 a.m. in Fort Lauderdale. I went up to the upper deck at Hard Rock Stadium today to see one of my old roommates, see some people, and I got stopped a couple times by listeners who said they appreciate our coverage and what we do, and that really means a lot. And it's nice to put some faces to that as opposed to just usernames and Twitter handles telling us we're doing a good job. So this is year 4 for me on the beat, year 3 at Lions 24/7, and it's been a really entertaining and fun ride. And given the trajectory that this program is on, it's who knows what's next. But so appreciate that a lot, and looking forward to bringing a lot of coverage this offseason.
And this is a wrap on my 8th season with Penn State. And I've mentioned this a few times, but my wife and I had never set foot in Happy Valley on Penn State's campus until I got hired to cover this team. So this is not something that's deep rooted for me. It's becoming that way because I'm almost a decade into it, but I'm with you. I got off the media shuttle, making our way into the stadium. The first person I encountered outside of Hard Rock Stadium said, TD, I listen to the podcast every day. Thank you. Thank you for your coverage. So I shook his hand. Unfortunately, I didn't get his name, but if you listen to every episode, you're currently listening. So thanks for saying hello. And hopefully we'll get to see more of you during the 2025 season. Daniel, go get some rest. I'm going to try to do the same. For now, I'm Tyler Donahue. This has been the Lions 24/7 podcast.